Welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Today we'll be continuing in our series on Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations with our fifth read in Book 5, Chapter 2, Part 2, Chapter 2 entitled Of the Sources of the General or Public Revenue of the Society, and Part 2 entitled Of Taxes. Part 2 is very long and it's broken up into several articles, and each article is broken up further into several subsections. I'll let you know when we get to the beginning or end of an article or a subsection. Today, for example, we are actually going to begin with what is entitled an appendix to Articles 1 and 2, and then we should also be able to get through Article 3 as well, and all in one reading. It'll be a little bit long today, so you have to bear with me, but we should be able to get through both of these articles in one shot. So without further ado, Appendix to Articles 1 and 2. Taxes upon the capital value of land, houses, and stock. While property remains in the possession of the same person, whatever permanent taxes may have been imposed upon it, they have never been intended to diminish or take away any part of its capital value, but only some part of the revenue arising from it. But when property changes hands, when it is transmitted either from the dead to the living or from the living to the living, such taxes have frequently been imposed upon it as necessarily take away some part of its capital value. The transference of all sorts of property from the dead to the living, and that of immovable property of lands and houses from the living to the living, are transactions which are in their nature either public and notorious, or such as cannot be long concealed. Such transactions, therefore, may be taxed directly. The transference of stock or movable property from the living to the living, by the lending of money, is frequently a secret transaction, and may always be made so. It cannot easily, therefore, be taxed directly. It has been taxed indirectly in two different ways. First, by requiring that the deed, containing the obligation to repay, should be written upon paper or parchment which had paid a certain stamp duty, otherwise not to be valid. Secondly, by requiring, under the like penalty of invalidity, that it should be recorded either in a public or secret register, and by imposing certain duties upon such registration. Stamp duties and duties of registration have frequently been imposed likewise upon the deeds transferring property of all kinds from the dead to the living, and upon those transferring movable property from the living to the living, transactions which might easily have been taxed directly. The vicissima hereditatum, the 20th penny of inheritances, imposed by Augustus upon the ancient Romans, was a tax upon the transference of property from the dead to the living. Dion Cassius, the author who writes concerning it the least indistinctly, says that it was imposed upon all successions, legacies, and donations in case of death, except upon those to the nearest relations and to the poor. Of the same kind is the Dutch tax upon successions. Collateral successions are taxed according to the degree of relation from 5 to 30% upon the whole value of the succession. Testamentary donations or legacies to collaterals are subject to the like duties. Those from husband to wife or from wife to husband to the 50th penny. The luctuosa hereditatis, the mournful succession of ascendants to descendants, to the 20th penny only. Direct successions, or those of descendants to ascendants, pay no tax. The death of a father to such of his children as live in the same house with him is seldom attended with any increase, and frequently with a considerable diminution of revenue, by the loss of his industry, or his office, or of some life rent estate, of which he may have been in possession. That tax would be cruel and oppressive, which aggravated their loss by taking from them any part of his succession. It may, however, sometimes be otherwise with those children who, in the language of the Roman law, are said to be emancipated, and that of the Scotch law, to be foris familiated, that is, who have received their portion, have got families of their own, and are supported by funds separate and independent of those of their father. Whatever part of his succession might come to such children would be a real addition to their fortune, and might therefore, perhaps, without more inconveniency than what attends all duties of this kind, be liable to some tax. The casualties of the feudal law were taxes upon the transference of land both from the dead to the living and from the living to the living. In ancient times, they constituted in every part of Europe one of the principal branches of the revenue of the crown. The heir of every immediate vassal of the crown paid a certain duty, generally a year's rent, upon receiving the investiture of the estate. If the heir was a minor, the whole rents of the estate, during the continuance of the minority, devolved to the superior without any other charge besides the maintenance of the minor and the payment of the widow's dower, when there happened to be a dowager upon the land. When the minor came to be of age, another tax, called relief, was still due to the superior, which generally amounted likewise to a year's rent. A long minority, which in the present time so frequently disburdens a great estate of all of its encumbrances, and restores the family to their ancient splendor, could in those times have no such effect. The waste, and not the disencumbrance of this estate, was the common effect of a long minority. By the feudal law, the vassal could not alienate without the consent of his superior, who generally extorted a fine or composition for granting it. This fine, which was at first arbitrary, came in many countries to be regulated at a certain portion of the price of the land. In some countries, where the greater part of the other feudal customs have gone into disuse, this tax upon the alienation of land still continues to make a very considerable branch of the revenue of the sovereign. In the canton of Bern, it is so high as a sixth part of the price of all noble fiefs, and a tenth part of that of all ignoble ones. In the canton of Lucerne, the tax upon the sale of lands is not universal, and takes place only in certain districts. But if any person sells his land in order to remove out of the territory, he pays 10% upon the whole price of the sale. Taxes of the same kind upon the sale either of all lands, or of lands held by certain tenures, takes place in many other countries, and make a more or less considerable branch of the revenue of the sovereign. Such transactions may be taxed indirectly by means either of stamp duties or of duties upon registration, and those duties either may or may not be proportioned to the value of the subject which is transferred. In Great Britain, the stamp duties are higher or lower, not so much according to the value of the property transferred, an 18% or half-crown stamp being sufficient upon a bond for the largest sum of money, as according to the nature of the deed. The highest do not exceed £6 upon every sheet of paper, or skin of parchment, and these high duties fall chiefly upon grants from the crown and upon certain law proceedings without any regard to the value of the subject. There are in Great Britain no duties on the registration of deeds or writings, except the fees of the officers who keep the register, and these are seldom more than a reasonable recompense for their labor. The crown derives no revenue from them. In Holland, there are both stamp duties and duties upon registration, which in some cases are, and in some are not, proportioned to the value of the property transferred. All testaments must be written upon stamped paper of which the price is proportioned to the property disposed of, so that there are stamps which cost from 3 pence or 3 stivers a sheet to 300 florins, equal to about £27 10 shillings of our money. If the stamp is of an inferior price to what the testator ought to have made use of, his succession is confiscated. This is over and above all their other taxes on succession. Except bills of exchange and some other mercantile bills, all other deeds, bonds, and contracts are subject to a stamp duty. This duty, however, does not rise in proportion to the value of the subject. All sales of land and of houses and all mortgages upon either must be registered, and upon registration pay a duty to the state of 2.5% upon the amount of the price or of the mortgage. This duty is extended to the sale of all ships and vessels of more than 2 tons burthen, whether decked or undecked. These, it seems, are considered as a sort of houses upon the water. The sale of movables, when it is ordered by a court of justice, is subject to the like duty of 2.5%. In France, there are both stamp duties and duties upon registration. The former are considered as a branch of the aid or excise, and in the provinces where those duties take place are levied by the excise officers. The latter are considered as a branch of the domain of the crown and are levied by a different set of officers. Those modes of taxation, by stamp duties and by duties upon registration, are a very modern invention. In the course of little more than a century, however, stamp duties have, in Europe, become almost universal and duties upon registration extremely common. There is no art which one government sooner learns of another than that of draining money from the pockets of the people. Taxes upon the transference of property from the dead to the living fall finally as well as immediately upon the persons to whom the property is transferred. Taxes upon the sale of land fall altogether upon the seller. The seller is almost always under the necessity of selling and must, therefore, take such a price as he can get. The buyer is scarce ever under the necessity of buying and will, therefore, only give such a price as he likes. He considers what the land will cost him in tax and price together. The more he is obliged to pay in the way of tax, the less he will be disposed to give in the way of price. Such taxes, therefore, fall almost always upon a necessitous person, and must, therefore, be frequently very cruel and oppressive. Taxes upon the sale of new-built houses, where the building is sold without the ground, fall generally upon the buyer, because the builder must generally have his profit, otherwise he must give up the trade. If he advances a tax, therefore, the buyer must generally repay it to him. Taxes upon the sale of old houses, for the same reason as those upon the sale of land, fall generally upon the seller, whom in most cases either conveniency or necessity obliges to sell. The number of new-built houses that are annually brought to market is more or less regulated by the demand. Unless the demand is such as to afford the builder his profit after paying all expenses, he will build no more houses. The number of old houses which happen at any time to come to market is regulated by accidents of which the greater part have no relation to the demand. 2 or 3 great bankruptcies in a mercantile town will bring many houses to sale which must be sold for what can be got for them. Taxes upon the sale of ground rents fall altogether upon the seller, for the same person as those upon the sale of land. Stamp duties and duties upon the registration of bonds and contracts borrowed for money fall altogether upon the borrower and, in fact, are always paid by him. Duties of the same kind upon law proceedings fall upon the suitors. They reduce to both the capital value of the subject in dispute. The more it costs to acquire any property, the less must be the neat value of it when acquired. All taxes upon the transference of property of every kind, so far as they diminish the capital value of that property, tend to diminish the funds destined for the maintenance of productive labor. They are all more or less unthrifty taxes that increase the revenue of the sovereign, which seldom maintains any but unproductive laborers, at the expense of the capital of the people, which maintains none but productive. Such taxes, even when they are proportioned to the value of the property transferred, are still unequal. The frequency of transference not being always equal in property of equal value. When they are not proportioned to this value, which is the case with the greater part of the stamp duties and duties of registration, they are still more so. They are in no respect arbitrary, but are or may be in all cases perfectly clear and certain. Though they sometimes fall upon the person who is not very able to pay, the time of payment is in most cases sufficiently convenient for him. When the payment becomes due, he must in most cases have the money to pay. They are levied at very little expense, and in general subject the contributors to no other inconveniency besides always the unavoidable one of paying the tax. In France, the stamp duties are not much complained of. Those of registration, which they call the control, are. They give occasion, it is pretended, to much extortion in the officers of the farmers general who collect the tax, which is in a great measure arbitrary and uncertain. In the greater part of the libels which have been written against the present system of finances in France, the abuses of the control make a principal article. Uncertainty, however, does not seem to be necessarily inherent in the nature of such taxes. If the popular complaints are well founded, the abuse must arise not so much from the nature of the tax as from the want of precision and distinctness in the words of the edicts or laws which impose it. The registration of mortgages, and in general of all rights upon immovable property, as it gives great security both to creditors and purchasers, is extremely advantageous to the public. That of the greater part of deeds of other kinds is frequently inconvenient and even dangerous to individuals, without any advantage to the public. All registers which, it is acknowledged, ought to be kept secret, ought certainly never to exist. The credit of individuals ought certainly never to depend upon so very slender a security as the probity and religion of the inferior officers of revenue. But where the fees of registration have been made a source of revenue to the sovereign, registered officers have commonly been multiplied without end, both for the deeds which ought to be registered and for those which ought not. In France, there are several different sorts of secret registers. This abuse, though not perhaps a necessary, it must be acknowledged as a very natural effect of such taxes. Such stamp duties as those in England upon cards and dice, upon newspapers and periodical pamphlets, etc., are properly taxes upon consumption. The final payment falls upon the persons who use or consume such commodities. Such stamp duties as those upon licenses to retail ale, wine, and spirituous liquors, though intended, perhaps, to fall upon the profits of the retailers, are likewise finally paid by the consumers of those liquors. Such taxes, though called by the same name, and levied by the same officers and in the same manner with the stamp duties above mentioned upon the transference of property, are however of a quite different nature, and fall upon quite different funds. Article 3. Taxes upon the wages of labor. The wages of the inferior classes of workmen, I have endeavored to show in the first book, are everywhere necessarily regulated by two different circumstances: the demand for labor and the ordinary average price of provisions. The demand for labor, according as it happens to be either increasing, stationary, or declining, or to require an increasing, stationary, or declining population, regulates the subsistence of the laborer and determines in what degree it shall be either liberal, moderate, or scanty. The ordinary or average price of provisions determines the quantity of money which must be paid to the workman in order to enable him, one year with another, to purchase this liberal, moderate, or scanty subsistence. While the demand for labor and the price of provisions, therefore, remain the same, a direct tax upon the wages of labor can have no other effect than to raise them somewhat higher than the tax. Let us suppose, for example, that in a particular place the demand for labor and the price of provisions were such as to render 10 shillings a week the ordinary wages of labor, and that a tax of 1/5, or 4 shillings in the pound, was imposed upon the wages. If the demand for labor and the price of provisions remain the same, it would still be necessary that the laborer should in that place earn such a subsistence as could be bought only for 10 shillings a week, or that after paying the tax he should have 10 shillings a week free wages. But in order to leave him such free wages after paying such a tax, the price of labor must in that place soon rise, not to 12 shillings a week only, but to 12 6/10. That is, in order to enable him to pay a tax of 1/5, his wages must necessarily soon rise, not 1/5 part only, but 1/4. Whatever was the proportion of the tax, the wages of labor must in all cases rise, not only in that proportion, but in a higher proportion. If the tax, for example, was 1/10, the wages of labor must necessarily soon rise, not 1/10 part only, but 1/8. A direct tax upon the wages of labor, therefore, though the laborer might perhaps pay it out of his hand, could not properly be said to be even advanced by him, at least if the demand for labor and the average price of provisions remained the same after the tax as before it. In all such cases, not only the tax, but something more than the tax, would in reality be advanced by the person who immediately employed him. The final payment would in different cases fall upon different persons. The rise which such a tax might occasion in the wages of manufacturing labor would be advanced by the master manufacturer, who would both be entitled and obliged to charge it with a profit upon the price of his goods. The final payment of this rise of wages, therefore, together with the additional profit of the master manufacturer, would fall upon the consumer. The rise which such a tax might occasion in the wages of country labor would be advanced by the farmer, who, in order to maintain the same number of laborers as before, would be obliged to employ a greater capital. In order to get back this greater capital, together with the ordinary profits of stock, it would be necessary that he should retain a larger portion, or what comes to the same thing, the price of a larger portion of the produce of the land, and consequently that he should pay less rent to the landlord. The final payment of this rise of wages, therefore, would in this case fall upon the landlord, together with the additional profit of the farmer who had advanced it. In all cases, a direct tax upon the wages of labor must, in the long run, occasion both a greater reduction in the rent of land and a greater rise in the price of manufactured goods than would have followed from the proper assessment of a sum equal to the produce of the tax, partly upon the rent of land and partly upon consumable commodities. If direct taxes upon the wages of labor have not always occasioned a proportional rise in those wages, it is because they have generally occasioned a considerable fall in the demand for labor. The declension of industry, the decrease of employment for the poor, the diminution of the annual produce of the land and labor of the country have generally been the effects of such taxes. In consequence of them, however, the price of labor must always be higher than it otherwise would have been in the actual state of the demand, and this enhancement of price, together with the profit of those who advance it, must always be finally paid by the landlords and consumers. A tax upon the wages of country labor does not raise the price of the rude produce of land in proportion to the tax, for the same reason that a tax upon the farmer's profit does not raise that price in that proportion. Absurd and destructive as such taxes are, however, they take place in many countries. In France, that part of the French tax which is charged upon the industry of workmen and day laborers in country villages is properly a tax of this kind. Their wages are computed according to the common rate of the district in which they reside, and that may be as little liable as possible to any overcharge. Their yearly gains are estimated at no more than 200 working days in a year. The tax of each individual is varied from year to year according to different circumstances, of which the collector or the commissary, whom the intendant appoints to assist him, are the judges. In Bohemia, in consequence of the alteration of the system of finances which was begun in 1748, a very heavy tax is imposed upon the industry of artificers. They are divided into 4 classes. The highest class pay 100 florins a year, which at 22 pence halfpenny a florin amounts to £9 7 shillings 6 pence. The second class are taxed at 70, the third at 50, and the fourth, comprehending artificers in villages, and the lowest class of those in towns at 25 florins. The recompense of ingenious artists and of men of liberal professions, I have endeavored to show in the first book, necessarily keeps a certain proportion of the emoluments of inferior trades. A tax upon this recompense, therefore, could have no other effect than to raise it somewhat higher than in proportion to the tax. If it did not rise in this manner, the ingenious arts and the liberal professors, being no longer upon a level with other trades, would be so much deserted that they would soon return to that level. The emoluments of officers are not, like those of trades and professions, regulated by the free competition of the market, and do not, therefore, always bear a just proportion to what the nature of the employment requires. They are, perhaps, in most countries, higher than it requires. The persons who have the administration of government being generally disposed to reward both themselves and their immediate dependents rather more than enough. The emoluments of officers, therefore, can in most cases very well bear to be taxed. The persons, besides, who enjoy public offices, especially the more lucrative, are in all countries the objects of general envy, and a tax upon their emoluments, even though it should be somewhat higher than upon any other sort of revenue, is always a very popular tax. In England, for example, when by the land tax every other sort of revenue was supposed to be assessed at 4 shillings in the pound, it was very popular to lay a real tax of 5 shillings and sixpence in the pound upon the salaries of offices which exceeded £100 a year, the pensions of the younger branches of the royal family, the pay of the officers of the army and navy, and a few others less obnoxious to envy, excepted. There are in England no other direct taxes upon the wages of labor. All right, that concludes today's reading. Our next read will be to begin Article 5, entitled Taxes Which It Is Intended Should Fall Indifferently Upon Every Different Species of Revenue. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.